John, thank you very much for that very nice introduction. When I get an introduction like this, I always think back to a time when I was visiting the Soviet Union, and I was lecturing there. And my host, who I like to think had an imperfect command of English, introduced me by saying, Professor Dallek is the author of several distinguished works. They're the kinds of books that once you put them down, you can't pick them up again. Not music to the author's ears. I also like to begin with an anecdote I love about my son, who when he was a boy of about 05, I guess, he said to me one day, Daddy, he said, you're a doctor, aren't you? And I said, well, yeah, but not like your doctor, not like your pediatrician. And he said, oh, I know that because you're also an historian. And I was delighted that he could make this distinction at so tender an age. But then he wanted to know, does that mean that you make people in the past feel better? So let's see what I can do for presidents tonight, if I can make any of them feel better. I wouldn't bank on it. I'd like to begin by saying that, telling the anecdote about Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and John F. Kennedy. In 1960, after JFK was elected, Robert Kennedy, John's brother, who of course became the Attorney General, came to Arthur and said, Arthur, you've been such a good supporter of our campaign. In fact, he had written a campaign study called Nixon and Kennedy Doesn't Make a Difference. See? And Bobby said to him, Arthur, how would you like to be an ambassador? And Schlesinger said to him, no, Bobby, if I do anything, I want to be at the White House. And so a few days later, Arthur saw JFK, and Kennedy said to him, well, Arthur, I understand you're coming to the White House. And Schlesinger said, I am? He said, what am I going to be doing there? And Kennedy said, I don't know, Arthur. I don't even know what I'll be doing there, but you can bet we'll both be busy more than 8 hours a day. Well, it was a wonderful anecdote, but what it revealed in part was the uncertainties of assuming that office. People don't know what they're going to get into when they become president. It is the most probably difficult job in the world. And after the men who've served in that office were there for a while, many of them came to recognize what a demanding and painful experience it could be. Thomas Jefferson said that the office was a splendid misery. See? Andrew Jackson called it a form of dignified slavery. William Howard Taft complained that people are so unrealistic. They think the president can make the grass to grow, the sun to shine, business to be good. He said, we have such limited power, and the demands on us are so extraordinary. See, Herbert Hoover described the office as a compound hell. Harry Truman said it was like riding on the back of a tiger. And he said he compared the White House to what he called the Great White Prison, or the Great White Jail. See, it was a case of a kind of suffering that they all, in one form or another, seemed to pass through. It's evidence, the evidence for the fact that it's such a difficult job to do, I think is testified to when you look at the fact that only 16 of the 43 presidents, only 16, were elected to second terms. Only 16. And of those 16, only 13 of them served out 2 terms. And Franklin Roosevelt, of course, did the 3rd term and was elected to a 4th term but died in office. The limits of the job, the burdens on them, are so substantial that when they go before the public for a 2nd term, if they choose to do that, they find more often than not they're rejected. Now, 16 two-term presidents. 3 of them, of course, never served out the second term. Lincoln and McKinley were both assassinated, and Richard Nixon was forced to resign. When Bush finishes his term, he will end up being only the 13th president to have done 2 full terms. It's kind of astonishing. So the question, as someone who's been reading about and thinking about and studying and writing about presidents for 40 plus years, that I've constantly asked myself is, what does it take to be an effective president? What has gone into effective presidential leadership? And let me lay out what I would describe as a matrix of influences, of things that I think they have to be very mindful of if they're going to be successful in the White House. First and foremost, I would say, is that every effective president has been a great visionary. There must be vision. You must have an idea of a larger design. Where are you going to take the country? What at the end of your 4 or 8 years will be the state of the nation? How are you going to move it in that direction? But not only must you have a vision, you must have the capacity to communicate it to the public in an understandable way. The most memorable presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, spoke of a square deal. Woodrow Wilson, the New Freedom. Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal. Harry Truman, the Fair Deal. John Kennedy, the New Frontier. Lyndon Johnson, the Great Society. Ronald Reagan, the Reagan Revolution. They had a grand design, and they communicated it to the people, to the public, in this concise way. And it caught the public's imagination. I think the measure of how important vision has been is testified to by the fact that Woodrow Wilson is remembered as the greatest visionary in American presidential history. His idea that World War I would be the war to end all wars, that it would make the world safe for democracy. These were grand illusions, of course, could not be realized. And yet Wilson comes down to us as one of the great presidents or near great presidents of American history. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that to this day, people can find that kind of vision so appealing, so compelling, so desirable. And so I would say first and foremost, for someone to be an effective president, they had better think in terms of some larger purpose, grand design. And in this current election, both candidates have jumped on the idea of what? Of change. Change. We need change in the country. And indeed, change, but optimism, hope. I find so interesting the fact that when you ask people in this country who are the greatest presidents in the nation's history, predictably they tell you Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. And then they will add the names, unlikely names, of John Kennedy and Ronald Reagan. Now, Kennedy was there for 1,000 days. Reagan, it's too soon. We still haven't had access to the documentary record which would let us write in some compelling way and in depth about Reagan's presidency. The reason I think Kennedy and Reagan have so much appeal to people is because they were so buoyant, so upbeat, so optimistic. Kennedy, the new frontier, promising to put a man on the moon by the end of the 60s, by the end of the decade. Reagan, it's morning in America. The pride is back. Jimmy Carter, remember him? He went up on the mountain, so to speak, and came down to give this speech about the energy crisis, and it was dubbed the malaise speech. The public doesn't want to hear about a malaise. It wants to hear about hope and optimism and some positive vision of where you're going to lead the nation. So I would say, first and foremost, you need to have some grand design, some grand vision that you're going to draw the country to. A second element of presidential effectiveness, I would suggest, is good old-fashioned practical politics, or pragmatism. Call it pragmatism. The most effective presidents in American history have been also great pragmatists. Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was a great believer in a large role for the United States in world affairs. But he also understood that the country was intensely isolationist during his presidency between 1901 and 1909. In 1904, 1905, there was the Russo-Japanese War. And TR was disturbed by that conflict because he wanted the United States to play a significant role in East Asia in general and China and Manchuria in particular. And he was worried that either the Japanese or the Russians were going to dominate and have too much power there, too much control. They're beating up on each other. The war is tending toward a stalemate. And TR calls upon them to come to Washington, to come to the United States, where he will mediate that conflict. In fact, he invites them to come not to Washington, but where? To Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Why in the world Portsmouth, New Hampshire? Now, it's a nice watering hole in the summer, as Washington is brutally hot. But what was at Portsmouth? The American Navy. It was the largest American naval base. And in essence, though he wasn't there at the conference, he was out at his home in Oyster Bay in Long Island. Symbolically, what he's saying to the Russians and the Japanese, see, boys, see that American fleet? You don't pay attention to us, we'll come out there and kick your ass. And T.O. was not above saying it that way. He gets a peace agreement, the Treaty of Portsmouth. And the American public goes wild over him. They love him. What has he done? He's the symbol of American pacifism, of bringing peace to the world. In fact, he believes in imperial America. And he wins the Nobel Peace Prize, the first American president to achieve that distinction. But he's the great pragmatist. He doesn't let on that he's an imperialist. He promotes the fiction, the notion that he is primarily and strictly a great pacifist. And it was a wonderful example of what I see as this pragmatic manipulation of public mood attitude. Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was the greatest pragmatist of any politician probably we've had in our history, certainly in the 20th century. Now, Roosevelt believes in the idea that you must command public support. He knows this is the case. And in 1932, when he's running for president, he promises a New Deal. He didn't know what this meant. He wasn't sure. Nobody around him was sure. But he knew this was a really good, captivating phrase. And he flies to the Democratic Convention in Chicago, first president in American history to get on a plane and fly. And he does it also because he's worried that the public will understand that he's infirm. What had happened to him in the 1920s? Of course, he had polio. He was immobilized. He couldn't walk. There is not a single photograph of Franklin Roosevelt demonstrating his disability. The press cooperated with him. He did this on purpose. He wanted the public to think of him as robust, powerful. He had lifted weights, and his upper torso was so muscular, was so powerful. He flies to Chicago, and he gives an acceptance speech. Again, this was breaking tradition, and he's saying, you see, I'm going to be a different president. There's going to be change with my administration. He runs in the campaign, and one of the hot issues in that year, believe it or not, was the protective tariff. He didn't give that much of a damn about the protective tariff. He didn't think it was going to change the economy of this country, which was in terrible decline. But he tells his brains trust, his advisors, to write 2 speeches, one for high tariff and the other for low tariff. See? And they say to him, well, you know, when you go out on that train and go across the country and you're campaigning, you're going to come to areas that it's not clear whether that's a region for high tariff or low tariff. What do we do? He said, we'll knit 2 speeches together. That's the definition of a damn good politician. See? He brings these 2 together, and when he gave speeches about the protective tariff in such an area, people in the crowd who were for high tariff thought he was for high tariff, and people in the crowd for low tariff thought he was for low tariff. And again, that's the definition of a goddamn good politician. See? He was masterful at this kind of thing. Now, he infuriated Herbert Hoover, his opponent. And Hoover said of him, this guy Roosevelt is nothing more than a chameleon on plaid. And that's exactly what he was, the chameleon on plaid. But it served him brilliantly. Now, his protege, one of his proteges, was of course Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, who prided himself on his pragmatic approach to politics. And Johnson used to love to tell 2 stories. One was about the guy he worked for in the United States House of Representatives when he first got into politics, a fellow named Richard Clayburgh. And Clayburgh was a lazy fellow. He was from South Central Texas, King Ranch. He was very wealthy and comfortable, and he didn't bother much doing anything. And Johnson would balance his checkbook for him and would take care of all sorts of minor details. And so he runs for re-election, and he's out on the hustings, and his opponent says, this guy's lazy, he's at Burning Tree Country Club playing golf, he's not a real congressman, and elect me. And so Clayburgh gets out on the hustings and gives a speech in which he says, I don't care that my opponent says I'm lazy, I don't care he says I'm out at the country club playing golf, I don't care he says all those nasty things about me, but what I do care about is that this is a man who goes up in the hills at night with sheep. And Johnson tells the story, he jumped up in the audience and he said, but Mr. Clayburgh, that's not true. And he said, Clayburgh looked down at him and said, well, then let him deny it. Now, Johnson loved it as a wonderful example of the pragmatism that politicians resort to. See, but his even more appealing story was about the Richard Nixon. Nixon went to Latin America in 1958 and was spat upon, stoned in Caracas, Venezuela, and came back to a hero's welcome at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. And Johnson was out there, he was then majority leader of the Senate, to embrace him. And a few days later, a reporter caught up with Johnson on Capitol Hill, and he said, Senator, I thought you told me 2 weeks ago that this guy Nixon was nothing but chicken shit, and I saw you out there yesterday embracing the vice president. And Johnson said, son, what you got to understand is that in politics, overnight, chicken shit can turn to chicken salad. And that's how he operated. When he was Senate Majority Leader, he had an intelligence bureau. He had this guy, Bobby Baker, who ultimately went to prison. But Baker was his intelligence guy. He would gather data on every member of the United States Senate. What did they like to drink? Were they happy with their parking space? Where did their wife want to go on a congressional junket? You see? And he would use that information to ingratiate himself. Joe, he'd say, I understand you're not so happy with that parking place. Maybe I can help you out with that. See? And he understood that this kind of personal connection could make a difference, you see. He manipulates. He's pragmatic. He's shifting and maneuvering. Ronald Reagan was supposed to be such a striking ideologue. Reagan was a brilliant pragmatist in American politics. When he was governor of California, Reagan announced that he was against the withholding tax. People should feel taxes, they should be burdened by them. They should be burned. They should be bothered by it. And he said, if you have a withholding tax in which you're taking money out of checks every week, every other week, every month, it is much less painful than if you do it once a year. And so he wants to have, he resists having a withholding tax. What happens is the state of California got into all sorts of fiscal difficulty, and he signs into law the first California withholding tax bill. And the reporters at a press conference say to him, Governor, we thought you said your feet were in concrete on that issue. And Reagan said, gentlemen, the sound you hear is the concrete breaking about my feet. See? He understood that he needed to shift ground. Abortion. He was dead set, he said, against a woman's right to abortion. This is before Roe v. Wade. He then signed into law the most liberal abortion statute of any state in the United States, because he understood that if he wanted to run for president, he was not going to be able to get there unless he agreed to this abortion statute. And so he is highly pragmatic. When he gets to the White House, he announces that the Soviet Union is an evil empire. And what does he do in his second term? He goes to Russia, accommodates himself to Gorbachev, goes to four summit conferences with them, and again, he trims sail because he understands this is necessary if he's going to have anything resembling a successful presidency. So vision, pragmatism. A third element of presidential effectiveness, I would say, is charisma, or the power of presidential personality. Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson gave speeches that people said were so lyrical you could have danced to them. Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt, again, the master politician who ingratiated himself with massive numbers of Americans. He comes to the White House. The country is in a state of economic collapse. And he pioneers the idea that he should use radio, the medium of radio, that he will go on the air and give what he calls a fireside chat, and creates the impression that he is your pater familias. He's your uncle. He's your friend. He's close to you. He's concerned about you. And he gives this speech in which he tells the public that, yes, there is a banking crisis, banks are collapsing, but he urges the country to take what he calls a bank holiday. He doesn't talk about a malaise or a downturn or a depression or a crisis, but there should be a holiday, a banking holiday. He was masterful at using rhetoric in that way. 3 days, bank holiday, the banks reopen, and people rush to put money back in the banks. Why? Nothing had changed in the economy. But Roosevelt, through the power of his personality, had created a kind of rapport with the public that created an upsurge of positive feeling. See? After he died, somebody stopped Mrs. Roosevelt on the street and said to her, I miss the way your husband used to speak to me about my government. Now, can you imagine anyone saying that about any politician now? I miss the way he used to speak to me about my government. The personal connection, the creation of this kind of charismatic tie. Reagan was also very, very effective at this. Remember, he was called the great communicator. And he went back to the idea of having Saturday radio talks because he remembered how effective Roosevelt was at that. And he reintroduced these radio talks, which now every president gives as well, you see. Why in this age of television do you need radio talks on Saturday morning? But Reagan remembered this. Roosevelt so effective at it, and he reproduced it, so to speak. Now, a couple of examples of presidents who were not very appealing as personalities to the public. One of them was Herbert Hoover. Hoover in the midst of the Depression People said he was so morose a rose would wilt in his hand. Hoover said, if only somebody could compose a poem, tell a joke, write a song that would lift the glum mood in the country. But he couldn't deliver it. He was like an amateur alongside of FDR. And Roosevelt utterly eclipsed him in that way. Lyndon Johnson. People have asked me, why is it that Lyndon Johnson is so little remembered now? This recent Democratic convention, it was the 100th, on August 27th, it was the 100th anniversary of Lyndon Johnson's birth. 100th anniversary. There wasn't a word about it at the convention. He's become what Joe Califano, his domestic counselor and chief of staff, has described as an invisible president. He's lost his hold on the public's imagination. Now, he's remembered as a vulgarian, as someone who was so overbearing and really in many ways an unpleasant character. And there are all these anecdotes that people tell about his unappealing personality. He got the first car telephone of any senator in Washington for his limousine. And Everett Dirksen, the Republican minority leader, went out and got a phone for his limo. He called Johnson up and he said, Lyndon, I want you to be the first one I spoke to on my new car telephone. And Johnson said, can you hang on a second, Ev? My other phone is ringing. He had to be the best. He had to dominate. He had to control. And it served him very poorly because he's remembered as this overbearing, calculating. You see, if you're pragmatic and you put this pragmatism in the service of some larger design of vision, then people are very forgiving if you're shifting and maneuvering. But if your pragmatism is seen as opportunism, is seen as a craven political maneuver in order to serve yourself, it's very destructive, very unhelpful. So Johnson loses control, in a sense, on this issue of personality. And so vision and pragmatism and charisma. A fourth element, I would say, is consensus. To be an effective president, you need to build a consensus in this country, and that is no mean feat. Think of what the next president is going to confront with the variety of problems that he will have to wrestle with. How will he create a consensus for some kind of national health insurance program? How will he create a consensus for some more effective regulation of the economy, of the banking system? These are going to be hugely difficult problems. How will he create a consensus as to what we do about Iraq, about Afghanistan, about Iran? These are going to be huge problems. But in a democracy like this, you need to have consensus. And the most effective presidents have been those who could establish it. Franklin Roosevelt, during World War II, there was tremendous pressure on him from the British and from some of his advisors to go before the Congress and ask for a declaration of war in 1941. And he told the British ambassador, I could do this and I could get that declaration of war, but he was afraid it wouldn't sustain itself because at the first setback in the fighting, people would fall away from him. And it was a godsend for him that he had Pearl Harbor. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that he arranged this. It was a genuine surprise. But it served him politically to knit the country together, to create a sense of shared purpose that was so important to the sustained fighting in World War II. Compare that to what happened in Vietnam, first in Korea. Harry Truman makes the decision, after we drive the North Koreans out of South Korea, that we should cross the parallel, go up in North Korea, and overwhelm that regime, and convert it from a communist government to a unified peninsula that's friendly to the United States. Well, MacArthur, of course, is pumping for this like mad. We cross the parallel, and the Chinese come into the war. And we find ourselves in this stalemate. The Chinese drive us down the peninsula. We drive them back up. The war stalemates at the 38th parallel. And we begin truce talks which go nowhere. And there's tremendous frustration in the country. The consensus for fighting in Korea is shattered. Truman's approval rating, if you think Bush has had problems, Truman's approval rating reached the lowest in American presidential history. It went down to 22%. 22%. Bush has been as low as, I think, 27, but he's not reached 22%. Truman lost the country. He couldn't govern. The last 2 years of his term were a disaster. He couldn't get anything done. There's an old adage in American history, war kills reform. He had this fair deal that he wanted to put across, and he couldn't get anywhere with it because of this stalemate in Korea and the loss of his ability to govern, the loss of consensus. Lyndon Johnson takes the country into the Vietnam War. In July of 1965, he announces at a press conference that he's sending 100,000 American ground troops into Vietnam. But he knows that there could be opposition to this, and he wants to mute the decision. And so when he announces that he's sending 100,000 troops into Vietnam, at the same press conference he announces that one of his daughters is pregnant and that he's making Abe Fortas an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. In January 1966, he decides that he has to put another 120,000 troops into Vietnam, and he says to his aides, I'm not going to announce it all at once. I'll announce 10,000 a month for 12 months. Deception, manipulation. By 1967, Johnny Apple of the New York Times publishes a front-page story in August of that year saying the war in Vietnam is a stalemate. And Johnson now is trapped. He's caught out. The consensus for the war is shattered. He keeps saying there's light at the end of the tunnel. And one wit said, sometimes the light at the end of the tunnel is from an on-rushing train. He can't govern. He's lost his hold on the public. The consensus has been shattered. George W. Bush loses his hold on the country over the Katrina disaster. Emblematic of that is the picture of him flying in Air Force One looking down on New Orleans. See, symbolically, he's above the crisis. He's not part of it. He's not engaged in a way that people feel, as Bill Clinton used to say, I feel your pain. And we make fun of it, but it matters. It counts for something. And Bush in the Iraq War, mission accomplished, and we go from 1 minute to the next in which there's this loss of life. 4,155 American troops have been killed there now. One can only imagine how shattered the consensus would be in this country if we had what? A draft. A draft. But without a draft, even without a draft, there is this loss of consensus for the Iraq War. And so consensus is an essential ingredient of effective presidential leadership. Fifth element, trust, credibility. A president who's lost the trust of the country, whose credibility is shot, is also someone who can no longer govern effectively. Now, presidents, it seems to me, have lost credibility in two ways. Either they promise more than they can deliver, or because they found out that they've been lying to the country. Woodrow Wilson promised to make that the war to end all war and to make this the war that would make the world safe for democracy. By 1919, nobody believed this anymore. And it shattered the trust in him. Now, of course, he suffered a terrible stroke in September 1919, and he couldn't govern anymore. But the consensus for his administration was gone. The trust in him was lost. Lyndon Johnson, again. He lost the trust of the country over Vietnam, promising repeatedly that we were doing well in that war. And people more and more were skeptical, disturbed by it. And again, a joke. Because these jokes, I think, are not really funny in the sense that they are so revealing of the hostility that people feel toward politicians. Sigmund Freud once said, humor is a form of hostility, see, and especially in political life. And Johnson, the joke made the rounds in Washington, how do you know when LBJ's telling the truth? When he pulls his earlobe, rubs his chin, he's telling the truth. But when he begins to move his lips, you know he's lying. Johnson didn't think it was funny. And they didn't trust him. The people marching up and down in front of the White House shouting, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? I interviewed Mrs. Johnson for my biography, and she told me it was a wound in his heart. But he knew in 1968 that he could not run again because the public had lost trust in him. He couldn't go out on the hustings. He couldn't go out and give a speech without being threatened with people booing and shouting him down. And he had to give up the presidency. He wanted to run again, but he couldn't do it. And so trust or credibility, you overreach yourself. Another way you lose credibility is if you lie to the public. Richard Nixon, the Watergate crisis, in the midst of that crisis, he held a press conference in which he said to the press, I am not a crook. Now, how can you govern this country if you have to tell it I am not a crook? It was the day his presidency was over, was ruined. Bill Clinton did himself such irreparable harm by waving his finger in front of the camera and saying, I did not have sex with that woman. Such an intelligent man to have done something so stupid. I don't care what he does, privately, but not to understand the political ramifications here, you see. And so he loses the trust of the country. Sixth, judgment. Judgment. In 1941, the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union June 22nd. Roosevelt's chiefs, military chiefs, said to him, don't give them Lend-Lease help. It's not going to do any good. Look what the Nazis did. They overwhelmed the French army, the greatest land army in the world, and they overwhelmed it in a matter of weeks. Don't give them help. Roosevelt made the judgment that he would give them help. Why? He knew some history. And he remembered what happened to Napoleon in Russia. And he said, winter will come. And if the Russians hold out for 6 months, the Nazis will be caught there in the snow, the sleet, the rain, the muddy roads, you see. They'll be able to hold out, and let's give them the help that will spur them forward, that will buoy them up. He exercised what one can describe as really effective judgment. John Kennedy, in 1961, April of 61, 3 months after he comes to the White House, he makes the decision to allow the Cuban exiles to invade at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. He has all sorts of qualms about this, doubts. He's suspicious of what his military and his CIA are telling him about the likely success of such an operation. But he makes the judgment that he has to do it, and he goes forward, and it is a disaster. And he fesses up to the fact that he has made a huge blunder here. In 1962, in October, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this time, he says, I'm going to make up my own mind. Curtis LeMay, the Air Force Chief of Staff, is urging him to bomb the Soviets, bomb those missile emplacements, invade the island, and Kennedy says no. His judgment is that this could be a great mistake. And we know now from the historical records and from the Soviet records that if we had followed Curtis LeMay's advice, we probably would have ended up with a nuclear exchange with the Soviets. It would have been a disaster of disasters. Kennedy held off. He resorted to diplomacy, and Khrushchev had the good sense to back away and to reach an accommodation over this missile crisis. So here, within one administration, Kennedy makes a bad judgment and then makes what seems to be a very wise judgment. Now, we historians have a huge advantage because we can know how things turn out. And so we can look back on it and exercise 20/20 hindsight, you see. But still, for all that, we need to make judgments on their judgments. And judgment, in the long run, is a major element in how we assess, evaluate these presidents. A final point. Luck. Luck. As Napoleon said, give me generals who know something about tactics and strategy, but best of all, give me generals who are lucky. See? If you have good fortune, it can be so helpful in serving your political designs, your conduct of the presidency. And yet, for all that, let me say that luck can only be carried so far. Circumstance can only be carried so far. After all, Herbert Hoover faced the same circumstances that Franklin Roosevelt did in 1932-33. And Hoover fails, and Roosevelt's a success. What's the difference? It's the difference between a man with vision and pragmatism, you see, and charisma and judgment and the understanding of the building of a consensus, and Roosevelt makes his own luck. So, yes, luck is important, but I would say to you that I think these other elements I've described, I've mentioned, are really so essential for presidential effectiveness, presidential leadership. So we come to the present moment in American history. Who, between these two candidates, will have the better vision, more persuasive vision, will be a greater pragmatist, will be more charismatic, will exercise better judgment, build and sustain a consensus, enjoy the trust and credibility of the country? I don't know. That's my answer at the moment. But we'll see who wins in November, and then they're going to be up against it. Whoever wins, they're going to have to deal with a crisis situation, I believe, that will match something resembling what Franklin Roosevelt faced in 1933. Not the exact same thing. History never repeats itself. But there are circumstances here that I think either candidate who wins is going to face. And it is going to be a huge challenge for them. Can they carry it off? The important thing is not them, but us, the country. How we fare, in part, depends on them. But we need to be above partisanship here, it seems to me, because whoever wins, and this is not to say I don't have my bias or that I'm not going to vote for one candidate or the other, but whoever wins, I wish them all luck, more than luck, hope that they can carry it off, because we're going to need a really effective presidential term with effective presidential leadership. Franklin Roosevelt said during his presidency, "This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny." And I think this young generation, the college students here in this audience, it's your country, your future. This is what it's about. And you need to pay attention and need to be prepared to confront the major difficulties that we're going to have. And that's, to me, the definition of citizenship, thinking about it, preparing to vote, voting using your best judgment, and hopefully getting it right. And if you send me an email, I'll tell you who to vote for, and then you'll get it right. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions. Yes, sir.
I object to the loose use of the word pragmatism. What is expedient and practical and popular isn't necessarily pragmatic. A pragmatist is someone who tries an idea, and if it fails, he abandons it.
Yes.
Lincoln did this repeatedly.
Roosevelt did it.
Kennedy
Yes.
abandoned ideas.
Yes.
But FDR, if one agency failed, he created another agency.
Exactly.
The other one
Yes.
continued.
Yes.
And then created a third agency and left. He was very good with
Yep.
trying ideas.
Sure.
But a pragmatist, it's very painful to be a pragmatist because you have to admit I was wrong and that idea is a bummer and I'm going to try another idea. But
Well-
it's used very loosely these days.
Sure.
Being pragmatic.
Sure. But I think the general understanding of the word, that's the way in which I was using it, and the way it's understood. And I think that a president, you're quite right, who takes it too personally, one could say this is another element of effective presidential leadership. If they take a setback too personally, if they see it as a blight on their reputation, I mean, it's one thing if you lose a war, but I'm talking if you take an initiative which the Congress doesn't buy and you have to shift ground, that's what you need to do. Because I think in some ways the worst presidents have been those who take everything so personally and kind of become vengeful and angry at the fact that they've suffered a setback. So that's, to me, you're quite right, I think. That's part of the pragmatism, that you need to be flexible. And Roosevelt, used to talk about the New Deal as being an experiment. He compared himself to the quarterback on the football team, and he said, I try one play, it doesn't work, I move on to something else. And I think it was a very apt metaphor for what went into his effective leadership. Yes, ma'am.
Is there another important element now that you hear so much about religion and lifestyle issues, whether you're against gay marriage? I mean, it has
Yes.
nothing to do with all these qualities, and yet for some people, those are the basic issues, even when the person they're thinking about goes against their basic economic and whatever
Yes,
interests.
yes.
Where does that come in? Is that
Well,
something new?
the historian Richard Hofstadter in the 1950s wrote with great brilliance about this, in which he addressed this idea that in times of prosperity particularly, people are inclined to vote their values rather than their economic interests. That what they become preoccupied with is one might describe as identity politics or status politics. And this whole, it's caught in this little anecdote about who would you rather have a beer with? See, I mean, and there's something so ludicrous about it. Because, I mean, you're never going to have a beer with this person. And who the hell cares about, having a beer with them? But this is what it adds up to. Is this someone who shares my values? And I think you're right. I think it's destructive to the country that people need to get outside themselves. Now, I understand that people feel passionately about certain issues. But, what's made this country effective, even great, is the ability to rise above these personal issues of identity, you see. There is a larger national concern, rather than whether this is a candidate who supports or opposes abortion. To me, that's a very distinctly secondary, tertiary thing alongside of what they're going to do about the economy or issues of jihadism, how we're threatened at this point by potential of outside attack. So, I mean, I agree with you entirely. And Winston Churchill said democracy is the worst possible system, except for all the rest. See? And I think he was right. And this is one of the drawbacks of the system, that people become, I think, too caught up in this kind of personal identity politics. But again, a president who's going to be successful needs to think about this. Reagan, for example, Reagan was very shrewd about this. Reagan was the first divorced president in American history. He spoke about church going. He didn't go to church very much. Family, his kids didn't like him all that well. And yet he was so adept at creating this image of himself as this sort of 19th century man who, small town culture, who was caught up in this old style American ethos. And so he's very shrewd about that. See, it was very effective. So, that's part of the pragmatism and the manipulation of image. And, I mean, there's an awful lot of manipulation in this, I grant that. I mean, I wish we could have somebody who got up and was, but maybe the best example, Barry Goldwater, was very forthright. He was very forthright. And he failed miserably. He got beaten by Lyndon Johnson to a pulp in 1964. Remember? He said, we should think about lobbing one into the men's room of the Kremlin. Meaning a nuclear bomb. See, now Johnson, he understood instantly this was a killer for Goldwater's campaign. And remember this ad? You know about the Daisy Field ad? Most famous political ad in American history, and it's only been used once. Only once. Johnson, with the help of Bill Moyers and some others, they designed this ad which showed a beautiful little girl sitting in a field of daisies, and she starts picking the daisies, the flowers, the petals off the flower, counting down, 10, 9, 8, 7, and when she gets down to 0, the nuclear bomb goes off in the background. And underneath the ad it said, "Vote for Lyndon Johnson, preserve her future." See? And the whole implication was that this is Bomber Barry, that he'll get us into a nuclear war. The bumper stickers of the day, those supporting him said, "In your hearts, you know he's right." And the Democrats countered with, "In your heart, you know he's nuts." See? Or they also said, "In your heart, you know he might." See? And it was, it was ugly politics. And there is so much of that kind of thing. These ads on television, I find them so offensive, so many of them. Who's profiting from them? The television stations. Does it advance the debate and the campaign at all? Not really.